I love animals. And when I was growing up, we had a ton of pets in our household. And when I went off to college, I studied wildlife biology. So not only did I have pets, but I also got to experience working with wild animals for a little while. Well, in my 30s, I lived in Scotland, and I lived at this residential retreat center, and part of my job there was to look after the livestock. Well, the livestock mostly consisted of chickens, ducks, turkeys, and geese. So, being the keeper of livestock is somewhere between like having pets and somewhere like looking after wild animals. Even though I could give affection to my birds that I looked after and love them, just like you could a pet, I couldn't really expect much love and affection back, just like you can't from a wild animal. But like pets, all of my birds had these unique personalities, and of course, I gave them names. And the names were based on some physical marking or some endearing characteristic that they had. For example, Skippy the rooster had deformed feet, so he kind of skipped instead of walked. I know, not a very creative name. Well, Larry, Mo, and Curly were these three big male turkeys that used to kind of bumble around and follow me everywhere, and they'd puff out their chests at me and fan their tail feathers, and they'd gobble at me, and that little thing on their beaks, would kind of get long and dangle, and basically they were trying to court me, which I thought was kind of sweet. And so Trevor, who was my work partner and sort of boss, he used to tease me about my boyfriends. Well, in the morning, I would let all of my birds out of their pens and their coops, and I'd feed them. And then in the afternoon, I'd feed them again, some supplemental grain. And then in the evening, I'd have to round them all up again and put them back in their shelters. And then I'd, close them in for the night. And every week, I had to muck out their pens and their coops. Now, we had over like 100 individual animals, so that was a lot of muck. And these birds were a lot of work, but I was so devoted to them, I loved them, and I didn't mind all of that. Well, every once in a while, I would have to deal with a sickly one, or one would get injured, and sometimes we'd find one dead. One day I found Skippy dead. And I speculated that he had been pecked to death by the others because they used to pick on him because of his deformity. And I buried Skippy, and of course I cried, because that's what one does. Well, we had 3 other roosters, but Trevor had to kill 2 of them because they started attacking people, so that left us with one sole surviving male, whom I named Rambo. Now, Rambo was a sweet, gentle rooster, and he was so good to his hens, which only endeared him to me even more. Well, here's a pro tip for you. Never name an animal that will one day end up on your dinner table. I guess I knew it was coming because we ate what we grew or raised, but still, Larry, Mo, and Curly, and Henrietta, and Pantaloons, and Splotches, and Piddle Paddle. Sometimes I was successful at persuading Trevor to spare some of my favorites, and he definitely did not touch Rambo. We also used to incubate eggs, and that helped us get the flocks to be more robust. Well, every once in a while, a chick or a duckling would emerge, and it would be deformed or sickly, and we didn't want any unhealthy animals in the flock, so Trevor would have to dispatch them, and I would take a hand trowel and dig a little grave and bury the poor little things, and of course I was always crying. Well, one of our chicken egg batches produced these beautiful 3 roosters. And they were black with white nape feathers, and they had these bright red combs, and they had these green sheeny tails that cascaded over their butts in this big feathery waterfall. They were gorgeous, and of course I named them, even though I knew I shouldn't. Well, we had to keep track of the ages of all the birds that we hatched, so we knew when to call them for the table. And we did this by putting colored bands on their legs, and we had a different color for each of the years that they were hatched. Well, the three big roosters got so big that we had to take the bands off because their legs were too big for them, and we had to use goose leg bands instead. Well, one of these roosters, whom I had named Henley, his leg had grown so big into this band that it actually started growing into the band. Just like a tree trunk will grow into barbed wire if the wire's kind of wrapped really tightly around it. So I had to take some pliers and pry this band off his leg. Well, it started to bleed pretty badly, and I was afraid it would get infected. Now, Henley was a beautiful rooster, and he had this great disposition. He was so sweet, and he was great with his hens, and we didn't want to lose him. That's what we wanted to breed into our flock. So I took him to the vet in town, and she sent us away with this liquid antibiotic that we would have to pour into his water. Well, the only problem with this was we would have to lock him away on his own for 10 days while he drank this medicine. So I put him in the grain shed, which was this cinder block windowless building, and it was kind of cold and damp. And to make it comfortable for him, I set up this heat lamp. So he had light and warmth. And then to make it extra special, I got this apple crate and I stuffed it with straw, and I stole a few towels from the house and I put it in there to make a cushy bed for him. And I would check on him every day, several times a day. And in the mornings I'd bring him porridge. I'd save a little from my breakfast. And so I would go in and I would talk with Henley. And I would tell him all the things that were going on with the other retreat residents. And sometimes I shared some tough emotional things that I was experiencing at that time. And Henley and I had some pretty deep conversations. Well, okay, so they were one-sided conversations, but he always listened to me without judging me and without giving me advice. And he would coo softly at me, which really soothed me. Well, after 10 days, I could let Henley out of the shelter, and immediately the other two roosters sensed something was up. They came running, and they attacked him. And it was really ugly to watch. It was noisy and bloody, and feathers were flying everywhere, and it was highly disturbing. So I managed to break it up, and I got Henley, and he was just covered in blood. I took him to the laundry room in the house, and I cleaned all his feathers off, and I inspected his wounds, and I realized, he's going to need a couple more days to recuperate. So I put him back in the grain shed for a couple of days. And then when I let him out again, the same thing happened. The other two roosters attacked him. Well, what Trevor and I didn't realize is when we had taken him out of the flock initially, we had completely upset the pecking order. Well, we had no idea. So for a couple of days, we just kind of let them fight it out, and it was horrible to watch. And every once in a while, I'd break it up, but I couldn't keep doing this the whole time because I had other work to do. So I just had to let these boys, sort it out for themselves, and I figured they would, and everybody would be peaceful again. And even if Henley ended up at the bottom of the pecking order, it didn't matter. Well, the last time I saw Henley alive, he was peacefully scratching for grubs by the leyland hedge along the edge of the chicken field. And a couple hours later, someone came to tell me that they had found him dead. I know. So I scooped up his limp body, and I carried him to the grain shed. And I was headed toward the garden to go ask Trevor to dig a grave. And I only made it about halfway there. I stopped in this little grove of trees that was next to the house, and there was this bench there. And there I sat for several minutes, sobbing my eyes out. I blamed myself for Henley's senseless death. He probably would have recovered if without all that fuss of locking him away with the medicine and all this. It was completely my fault. A couple hours later, I buried him, and I said a prayer, and I apologized to this beautiful bird that I had raised from a hatchling. And Trevor tried to console me. He said, look, it wasn't your fault. It's the way it is. This is farm life. We just have to deal with it. And then he recited a poem. You greeted us early with the dawn. You crowed your heart out on the lawn. With beak so shiny and comb so red, it's such a shame now that you're dead. I didn't speak to him for 2 days. After that incident, I tried pulling myself back emotionally because I was trying to protect myself from the hurt when the inevitable happened, when we would have to kill one that was hatched, sickly or deformed, or when we would have to kill some for the table. So for one thing, I stopped naming so many of them. And then I started trying to treat them less like pets and more like a farm commodity, but it never really worked. I found that I really couldn't harden my heart in that way. And so eventually, as more birds hatched, of course I grew attached to them, and I would name them, and I had my favorites, and I would cry every time one of them died, whether it was by our own hands or something else. I guess I came to accept that heartache was a risk I was willing to take for love. Thank you.